Thanks for joining me for a little bit today for an on-demand module titled Focus Note Taking, subtitle Take Note of What You Wrote. This will be a great time to go ahead and get out some Cornell note paper. I'm going to ask that you only write in the notes section during this presentation today, and I'll tell you when we're going to use the other sections. Let's start off with our word of the day. Who can figure out the word of the day? Maybe get a prize. What's that word? Shout it out. It's okay to holler in the classroom. The word of the day is repetition. If you don't know what repetition is, here's a fake definition for you. Repetition is the act of repeated action, repeating over and over, multiple times, repetitiously, repeatedly. You get the idea, repetition. So why is this the word of the day? Well, what are some examples of repetition in our life? Maybe if you're memorizing a song, maybe if you're learning how to shoot a free throw, maybe you're trying to teach your dog how to do a backflip, or maybe if you are getting ready for a test. All of those are examples of things that you learn through repetition. One more example, hopefully most of you wash your hair. Maybe some of you use Super Mario Brothers shampoo like I do. If you flip that shampoo over to the back, you're going to see instructions right there that say wash, rinse, repeat. Don't blame me if you can't read Chinese. So on that Cornell note paper, let's start off with our essential question for this module today. If you'll copy this down in that essential questions section. If you don't have an essential questions section, then you can just write EQ on your top line and copy this sentence down. How can my Cornell notes help me make better grades? If you'll copy that down just how it says it there, that's hopefully what we're going to get answered here in the next 10 minutes or so. So you're thinking to yourself about now, hey, Cornell Note Video Maker guy, what does repetition have to do with my life? I'm glad you asked. What you're looking at here is a graph called the rate of forgetting, which comes from research by a German statistician named Hermann Ebbinghaus. And what this data shows is that with any type of information, after our initial interaction with that information, our retention of that is going to go down to 60, 50, 40, even down to 30% retention from where we initially started, which is pretty bad news, except that with a first repetition of that material, we can bump our retention all the way back up to close to 100%, and then it's going to go down even slower than it did before. And as it starts to fade away in our brain again, we can bump it up with a second repetition, and then continue bumping it up with a third, fourth, and fifth repetition where that level of retention stays really high. So why this is good news is that if you had to test, say right here around day 8, if all you had was your initial interaction with that material, you would expect to have less than 40% retention, and you would probably expect to fail that test. But if we had gone back and gotten a first repetition of that information, then our retention is significantly higher, although it's still below 60%. But with the second repetition, now I'm up above 70%. I would expect to pass that test. And if I had even gotten a third repetition, my retention level is above 90%. I would probably have enough knowledge to make an A on that test. So that kid that sits with you in your pre-AP or honors class that always makes good grades, it's not just because they're smarter than you, it's because they figured out how to get multiple repetitions of the material. In AVID, we call this the 10-24-7 strategy, which means that within 10 minutes to 20 minutes of our initial interaction with information, we're going to get our first repetition. And as that information starts to fade away in our head, we're going to get our second repetition within about 24 hours, and then our third repetition within 7 days. So that when that test or assessment comes along, I'm ready to go. I know I have enough information to be able to get an A on that test. All right, so you've convinced me multiple repetitions are important. What does that have to do with Cornell notes? I'm glad you asked. Let's look at how using the steps of the Cornell note-taking process, it forces us to get multiple repetitions of information and keep our retention level high. Using that big section on the right, the notes section, where hopefully you're taking notes right now, some strategies to get multiple repetitions are going back in that 10 to 20 minute frame, maybe at the end of class, maybe between periods, maybe during lunch, circling words that you think were key from the notes that day, maybe highlighting or underlining some main ideas. As you read through your notes, if you identify something that you're a little bit confused about, maybe putting a question mark there, and then as you're looking through your notes again saying, hey, the teacher said that's going to be on the next test, let me put an asterisk there to make sure I know that that's going to be a possible test question. That's 4 options for repetitions using the notes section. What about the left section, the question section? Well, the way that we get multiple repetitions there is by first off chunking our notes into multiple sections there. Once I've got my notes chunked, what I'm going to do is write a corresponding question for each of those main ideas in those chunks. So if I had 3 chunks, I'm going to have 3 questions in my left column. And remember that I'm always thinking like a teacher, trying to anticipate what the test question is going to be over that section. All right, so what about that summary section at the bottom? What I want to do there is read back through all the questions that I've written on my page of notes here, my essential question and my questions in the left column, and write a 1-sentence answer or response to each one of those questions to build my summary. What that forces me to do is to go back and read my essential question, to read my notes, to read my questions, and basically getting another repetition of all of that information that's there on the page. And now that I've built my learning tool, I can use my page of notes to study for tests a couple different ways. First off is the fold over method, where I put a crease down my page of notes right there along that left column line. And I have my questions there. Hopefully I was thinking like a teacher there. I've got some good potential test questions. And then if I ever forget the answer to that test question, I've got it right there in my notes also. Anything that I'm still confused about, I can bring that question to tutorials. I can always use my Cornell notes as a resource during tutorials. And then lastly, I always want to be studying, revising, comparing my notes with a friend, making sure that my notes are accurate, and using that skill of collaboration that we work on in Avid all the time. So we just looked at 10 different ways to get multiple repetitions of information using your Cornell notes. But maybe you're thinking to yourself about now, hey, Cornell note maker guy, you sound like a jerk. I'm only going to do half of what you told me to do. That's okay, because even with 5 repetitions of the material, we know that our retention level is going to stay really high, above 90%, and when that test comes around, we're going to have all the information we need to be able to make an A on the test. Pop quiz, hotshot. Pete and Repeat are standing on a bridge. Pete falls off. Who's left? Repeat. Okay, Pete and Repeat are standing on a bridge. Pete falls off. Who's left? Don't ask me to repeat it. Does anybody out there like CSI? I do too. Remember on CSI that you can't convict a criminal unless you've got some evidence. And I can't convict you of being a Cornell note superstar unless I've got some evidence of repetitions in your notes. So let's look at, using these 10 strategies for repetition, what are some of the evidence that we could see in our notes? Well, circling keywords, that's easy enough. I should be able to see some circles. Underlining or highlighting our main ideas, maybe we're doing that in different colors. That's an easy way to have evidence that we're using repetition. Maybe putting a question mark by our points of confusion, I should be able to see evidence of question marks. If I'm going to asterisk possible test questions, then asterisk or star. Okay, those are the easy ones. Okay, what about number 5, chunking and questioning? Well, if I'm going to chunk, I should be able to see chunking lines all the way across my notes. If I'm going to write a summary that links everything together, maybe the number of sentences in my summary should be the same as the number of questions that are on my page of notes. If I'm going to do the fold over method, some pretty good evidence there is actually having a crease in the paper. And then the last 3 all refer to tutorials, and so I should be able to look at a TRF as evidence that you're using repetitions in your notes. So just as an example here of what we're talking about, looking at Sanders' TRF, her initial question here comes from her notes. This is how she's getting another repetition. Also in her resources section, one of the resources that she's going to use during tutorials today is her Cornell notes. And then just a reminder that during tutorials, she's also practicing taking notes. All right, CSI team, we ready? Let's go looking for some evidence. Here's case number 1. This is Tiffany and her world history notes. At first glance, this case looks like she's got pretty good notes here. She's got notes in her right column, questions in the left column, summary in the bottom column. But when we dig a little closer, looking for evidence of repetition, I don't really see it here. It looks like Tiffany probably wrote her questions in class the same day. It looks like she probably wrote her summary in that same pen that same day, which means that she didn't get any repetitions of this information, which means she's probably not going to do very well in this Roman Fine Arts test. What about case number 2? We're going to look at Hector's notes here about figurative language. I know some of you guys are doing most of your notes on your computer or on a tablet. And so some people say, well, we can't do repetitions on Cornell notes if we do our notes on a computer. Well, that's not true, because Hector here showed us, as we look for evidence, he's got circled keywords, he's got different colors, he's got question marks where he identified points of confusion, hyperbole down there at the bottom, he asterisked a future test question. So Hector did a great job of getting repetitions over these notes. He's probably going to do pretty well in this test. Our last case here is Deja's notes over mixtures and compounds. Honestly, when I see a lot of Cornell notes looking in students' binders, this is what I see a lot of the time. Nothing in the left column, nothing in the bottom section. And so let's see if we can help Deja out a little bit and help make her notes a little bit better. So maybe a first step would be for her to go back and circle some keywords, maybe highlight some things that are important, maybe mark something she wants to bring back to tutorials, and maybe put an asterisk by something that's going to be on her future test. There we go. We're already up the curve of forgetting, Deja. There's our first repetition. But we're not done yet. Let's go ahead and chunk our notes and write some questions for those chunks looking at those main ideas. We're up to repetition number 2, but we're still not done because now we're going to write a summary over those notes, answering the questions that I wrote in my left column and my essential question if I had that there also. That's our third repetition, but Deja's still not done because Deja's now going to go and take her point of confusion to tutorials, get that question answered, and then the night before the test, she's going to study using the fold-over method. She's up to 5 repetitions over this information now. Well, who cares? Why does it matter if Deja gets up to 5 repetitions? Well, if that test was about this time, 8 or 9 days later, if Deja had just taken that first page of notes, she would have had about 30% retention. She could have expected to fail that test. But now that she's had 5 repetitions over that, her retention level is going to be up here. Deja's now an A student. So hopefully you've been taking notes as we've been going along here, and that's a good thing because guess what? About a week from now, you're going to have a test. And I wrote the test, and it's stinking hard, and you're going to fail. Unless we practice what we've been talking about here. So maybe tomorrow, we can go and compare and revise our notes with the partner. Maybe your teacher will give you time in class. Maybe you need to do that on your own. Maybe on day 2, we go through for homework and chunk our notes and then write corresponding questions over those chunks. Maybe the points of confusions that we identified in our notes, things that you forgot, things that you didn't really understand, you're going to bring to tutorials. And then finally, the day before the test, you're going to go ahead and summarize your notes and study using the fold-over method. And based on those 4 repetitions, when that test comes around, you're going to be prepared, you're going to make a good grade. So in summary, what have we learned here today? First off, that repetitions are huge. It's the only way that anybody learns anything. Number 2, Cornell notes are a great way for you to get up to 10 repetitions of information. And why is that important? Because number 3, the more quality repetitions you get, the better your grades are going to get. Not just doing the steps to do the steps, but actually taking the time and going through those repetitions well, you're going to start seeing an increase in your grades that you're making. Thanks for taking a little bit of time here with me today, and good luck on your test.